This is the Anything Show with John Francois.
Larry Rifkin, man, it is such an honor to have you. I'm going to let you know in just a moment how responsible you are for the joy of my childhood. But yeah, first, let me introduce you. You're the author of the book No Dead Air, and this one of the interview subjects, one of many interview subjects in the fascinating documentary about the rise and fall of Barney the Purple Dinosaur called I Love You, You Hate Me, which I believe is going to be released on the Peacock streaming service on Wednesday the 12th. We're recording this the day before on Tuesday the 11th. Larry, it's so much fun. It's such an honor to have you. And we were just talking beforehand about how you were the head of programming for Connecticut Public Television. Now, correct me if I'm wrong on this. Barney, as I kind of know from his history, he launched in the late 80s through a series of videotapes that really blew up through word of mouth. Then that got into live concerts, and then that eventually launched into public television. Was Connecticut Public Television the first PBS station to air Barney?
Well, in essence, we were, but everything we did toward bringing Barney and Friends to television was meant for a national audience. But we brought Barney in the year before as we were developing the series for PBS. And therefore, we had the opportunity, bringing Barney to Connecticut, to use some of the old Barney and the Backyard Gang tapes to promote the events in the state of Connecticut. But everything about it was meant to be national. It was never meant to be only on Connecticut Public Television. And as you know, the creator and our co-producers, the Lions Group, they were out of Dallas, Texas, or the Dallas area. And we made the connection because I think you may understand this, but maybe some of your listeners don't, that public television programming emanates from local stations or independent producers, not from PBS. By statute, by charter, because WGBH and WNET, the behemoths in the system, were organized as production facilities before the onset of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. But they made it clear, as the two strongest stations, that they wanted everything to go through stations or independent producers. So we were looking for national programming, but we were told, don't get involved in anything that was at an early nascent stage, because you can lose your shirt trying to do national programming. One misstep, and you've spent $100,000, $10,000, $1 million on something that never goes anywhere. So having found one of those videotapes, John, that you mentioned, through the eyes of my daughter, Leora, and me calling Cheryl Leach, the creator, the next day, that was Super Bowl Sunday, 1991. The next day, I was on the phone with Cheryl and said, have you ever thought about PBS? And the rest is somewhat history.
Now, how old is your daughter, Leora?
Right now? Well, she was 4 at the time. She's 36 today.
Okay. So this interview means a lot to me, because to say that I was a Barney fan is an understatement. I was born in November of 91. Barney, I think, came out on television in 92.
April 6th, 1992.
So I'm a Connecticut native. So I was perfect for that Barney audience. And I actually asked my mom earlier today, please, if you can, give me pictures, give me anything that you can find. Because I had the videotapes, I had the stuffed animals, I had the bed sheets, I had the pajamas. And my mom sent me like 3 or 4 photos of, me, John Francois as a kid back in the early 90s, just absolutely obsessed and over the moon with Barney. I never let that stuffed animal go. So once I heard about this docuseries and had the opportunity to speak with you, I just had to mention that, because it's just, it shows.
You understand. I mean, what a remarkable impact and imprint it's had on generations of young people in terms of musicality. I mean, look at the stars. I mean, Demi Lovato and, of course, Selena Gomez and others. I think the point being that Barney was a phenomenon that broke out of public television so quickly and so determinedly that a lot of pressure was put on Barney. Even when things like Fred Rogers, now today he's venerated in everyone's mind. And that's thanks to the documentary done about him and the movie with Tom Hanks. But if you think about it, for many years, he was the butt of a lot of jokes in America, Mr. Rogers. And what's so interesting, John, I think, and people, if they read my book, No Dead Air, will see the comparisons that I draw from Fred Rogers and that lineage to Barney. And I say that in many ways, if you remember Bob Dylan in 1965, well, you're too young, but many will remember Bob Dylan going electric at the Newport Folk Festival. And a lot of his folk fans were really incensed. What's he doing here? Well, in a sense, Barney was Fred Rogers going electric.
Wow. Yeah. And I remember you said that in that docuseries. Larry, I want, if you could, please just give me a nice visual of what went into the initial conversations to bring Barney on the air to, first Connecticut Public Broadcasting and then just eventually beyond. So you mentioned that, just like, kind of like how Cheryl created the show, she was, kind of observing her kid and what made him happy and all that thing. And that's how we got Barney. So you had mentioned that you had seen the effect that Barney had on your daughter. Can you just take me back and describe exactly how your daughter was looking, how she was feeling, paint a picture for me.
Boy, you're really testing an old man's memory. But I will say that it was a really wonderful regular day. And she was not a big videophile, Leora, but she just saw on a lower shelf where it should be positioned so a little person could go and get it. And she saw this video and it attracted her. It was Barney and the Backyard Gang at the time. That's what the home videos were, a day at the beach. And I thought it looked innocent enough. I knew that PBS was looking for some new material to go along with Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers, but I never thought that Connecticut Public Television, John, would enter into the sweepstakes because children's programming is truly the holy grail on public television. There is nothing more sacrosanct, nothing that, in a sense, is more guarded and protected in terms of its importance to the whole public television system. Talking about Fred Rogers, he was the one who really protected the initial investment that Congress made in public television. If you go back and you can look on YouTube to a hearing where Fred Rogers basically saved the entire federal appropriation on his own. It's a remarkable piece of video. But having said that, so we took it home. And Leora, in those days, it was VHS, and she needed Dad to keep coming back and seeing what it was because I had to rewind that tape. And I kept coming in saying, maybe I should pay a little bit of attention to this, given the business that I'm in, never thinking in a million years, John, that A, I would call Cheryl Leach the next day, B, that call would be responded to by PBS and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting about 4 months later, after a lot of due diligence, a lot of vetting on their part, with a grant of $2.25 million. And off we were on what turned out to be the greatest adventure of my life. And having 1 year of gestation where people were wondering, what is Larry working on? Because I was the head of programming for the Connecticut network. I had a lot of other responsibilities. I had local programming for the state of Connecticut. I had other national programs. I had our program schedule to oversee. And yet I spent about 70% of my time during that year getting it ready, conforming it to PBS standards, and then bringing forward 30 episodes. But John, the part of the story, and Leora was just fascinated by it. She loved it all. And that really said something to me. And I think it's such an important lesson. And Leora is so generous in saying, my dad listened to me. My dad listened to what I had to say, because how would I know, John, that this was a perfect or nearly perfect preschool program? Later on, I learned that when we had some research done by people at Yale University, Dorothy and Jerome Singer, who at that time ran this Children's Television Research Center. And they said that Barney and Friends, and by the way, they were big fans of Fred Rogers as well, had over 100 learning moments, emotionally, cognitively, and developmentally in terms of movement and such in every episode, and that it was, quote, nearly a perfect preschool program. But I listened to my daughter, and I think that's a really important lesson for us as adults. Sometimes the wisdom, the generosity of young people, their untouched innocence and naivete can tell you more than what we consider to be our astuteness at a time when we've grown so cynical and so skeptical. And I know that that is brought out in the documentary, the question as to whether America was already divided or whether, in fact, this was a moment in time that demonstrated America's fragility in terms of its own psyche and whether we've ever recovered. Now, I haven't seen the documentary yet. As an interviewee, they don't really like to hand it out in case you say, hey, what happened to that conjunctive phrase of mine that you took off? That was the most important thing I said, and you edited it. So they don't really like for interviewees. I never did when I was doing production.
Well, I've seen just short of a few minutes of the last episode. I've seen pretty much the entire docuseries, and I was both fascinated, of course, as a Barney fan, and also heartbroken because really the main point of the show is to talk about why Barney was such a polarizing character. Now, can we dive into what specifically about Barney's personality attracted children like your daughter? And of course, myself, when I was growing up in the 90s. I mean, of course, we know the educational value of the show, but what specifically was it about Barney as a person that every little kid was just like, okay, I got to watch this dinosaur. He's my kind of guy.
Well, because Barney was unconditional in the love that he provided, and children need that desperately. And that's, I'd like to get into the fissure of why some adults reacted the way they did. A lot of us men, and my daughter, who has a master's degree now from the University of Pennsylvania in positive psychology, brings this out so well in terms of her discussion of all of this. But the fact is, a lot of us males, a lot of us dads, we can't measure up to that. And so when somebody you see on screen is so effervescent and so ebullient in giving your daughter or your son that sense of empowerment and feeling good about themselves, sometimes you may feel that that's over the top and it's not something you can recreate in terms of the way you manifest your love for your child. It's there, but you don't express it perhaps in the way that Barney does unconditionally. The second thing, by the way, that Barney did, I think, in families, and I didn't really say this in the documentary, but he was really the first disruptor in many families, because just like hand-me-down clothes, John, the kids would watch whatever the older sibling put on until something appropriate for them came along. And then they said, hey, wait a minute, Mom, wait a minute, Dad, this is my moment, this is my time, this is my character. So what did Barney also provide? It was edutainment. I know I don't want to just appropriate that term, but that's what Cheryl Leach used to call it. You educate and you entertain at the same time. And what people really have to understand is that for a youngster, education is entertainment because they're fascinated by everything. Everything's new to them. So when there's a dress-up thing going on Barney, they say, wow, that looks so fascinating, that costume. I want to get into that costume. Or if there's a movement activity, that to them, it's all fresh, it's all new. We may have seen it 1,000 times in our lives, but to a child, it's all wonderment. So Barney provided that. And don't forget, music underpinned everything in Barney. It was such an important, go back and listen to the music. Anybody who can find it on YouTube, just to be reminded of how clever it all was in terms of the movement along of the show. The colors were dynamic. Now, not always in Barney and the Backyard Gang, but I think we came in, public television came in, and we worked so hard to improve the production of the show. Seeing other children leading the dynamic and having a role of empowerment, I think meant a lot to the children. And Barney was just, well, a whole lot less neurotic than Big Bird. Let's put it that way. And don't forget, Barney was written on one level, John. It wasn't written for mom or dad. So the fact that they didn't get it really didn't mean a whole lot to us. We knew who our audience was and we met their need. And that was because Cheryl Leach, Kathy Parker, and Dennis DeShazer, the three principals down in Texas, they had done a lot of research. They had poured through all of the home videos at the time to see what was working, what was not. And they created this wonderful character. Now, as I say in my book, and I updated a chapter just to deal with these issues, that in fact, you could have put the 10 best children's producers in America at the time in a room with an unlimited budget and an unlimited amount of coffee, and they never would have come up with anything like this. Because as you know, John, as a creative, that's not how creativity works.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, in this docuseries, not only are we, of course, getting right into the people that hated Barney's unconditional positivity and love to the point of, you know, physical bashing, verbal bashing, death threats, secret societies that said, I hate Barney, all that stuff. It also, you know, kind of simply from a parent to child relationship, as you kind of touched on earlier, Barney was the kind of character that was specifically only appealing to children because, you know, one thing, especially when you're a preschooler, what you love is a very optimistic wonderment of the world and also repetition. Like there's comfort in repetition. And I think the combination of just that unconditional positivity and optimism and the repetition of Barney from the music to just, you know, certain things that he said.
Barney came alive at the beginning of every episode.
Exactly.
Yeah, all of that. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And the fact that he had that smile plastered on his face for 24/7, 365. For a 3-year-old kid who is, you know, naive and trying to learn about the world, great, comforting. For a parent, I can understand why it would just kind of drive them crazy because, of course, they've already seen the cynicism, the flawedness of the real world. So speaking as a parent yourself, even though you did make that programming decision to put Barney on the air, was there that personal parent side of you that thought, oh, okay, yeah, I can kind of see why it might drive some older people crazy?
Honestly, no. And I want to say this, that while we were going through all of this, it's a good question, John, it really is. But we didn't feel all that umbrage, all that pushback. I mean, the pushback that I was most concerned about, John, throughout was frankly coming from within the public television system, because not only were we new on the scene to the world, and by the way, I think one of the things that happened was the ubiquitous nature of America profiteering off of Barney. In other words, you might have thought that we were trying to have Barney on every street corner or every gas station opening or supermarket event. But it wasn't our team. It wasn't necessarily the Lions Group, our co-production partners. They did a lot of marketing, don't get me wrong. But it was America that saw, like in America, nothing succeeds like excess. And so the whole country took Barney. And normally public television programs are left in our public television cocoon. They don't come out. They stay there. And for those who love public television, they know all the characters on Masterpiece Theater or great performances. But the society doesn't. But this one broke out of any confine we could try to put it in. And everybody was trying to make a buck off of Barney. Did that hurt us? Yeah, I think it did, because it was just so omnipresent that you could not escape it. Therefore, it became part of the conversation in America. And don't forget, I know this may feel like a stretch, but I say it in the updated version of my book, that the Cold War had ended. We really didn't have anyone else to fight with outside. We always had the communist bugaboo outside that we would always look at as the evil intruder into our lives. Now we were kind of free to have some fun. Now, the 90s, I know the cynicism began to build with Beavis and Butthead and Jerry Springer and all of that. But still, compared to the time when we were fighting the Soviets or to this moment in time right now, 2022, where our politics has never been more fractured, at least in modern times, it was an innocent period. The economy was doing pretty well. Technology was just coming online. We hadn't yet built that balkanization of our politics. So it was a good moment in many ways. So maybe people just needed something to rail against because they were good times in general.
Now, going back to your comment about excess, because that's always been a fascinating thing to me, the relationship between iconic public television characters like Barney and Big Bird and, you know, the merchandise that really makes them more popular, because I've always understood public television to sort of stand for, okay, we're not for profit. We're here to have a public service. We're here to provide education, informative entertainment, that kind of thing. So whenever you see, you know, characters like Barney in a store, either, you know, the stuffed animals or the pajamas or whatever, it's just like, wait a minute, but doesn't that make it a sort of for-profit thing at that point?
Look, that's a great question. And you have to understand how important that consideration was to what I think were many of the battles that I was fighting within public television. One thing, John, that is not revealed, I don't think, in the documentary, but is the subtitle of my book, Career Reflections from the TV Executive Who Saved Barney the Dinosaur from Extinction. We were canceled, John, shortly after we went on the air. Nobody knew it because we were still in the midst of our first run of the first 30 episodes. But the new people who came in, because the person who green lit everything at PBS, Jeff Gable, had left. So we were an orphan, as I said in the book. And we really were hard pressed to get ourselves back on the air. The reason we were able to do it was that program directors all across the country felt this shaking and this incredible force that was building on behalf of it. Parents were calling in, my kid, what is this? When's it on? How many times a day can they see it? Is Barney coming to Baltimore or to Miami? I've got to get my child in front of Barney. So it was really the children who, in effect, saved Barney. But I ran the campaign on behalf of the children, and we got that decision reversed. But I want to get back to what you said. You see, Children's Television Workshop, Sesame Street at the time, now Sesame Workshop, they were a nonprofit. So they had a fig leaf to cover them when people questioned all the marketing and merchandising. I brought into the system a for-profit partner. Now, we worked out a deal where PBS and the Connecticut Public Television Network got a piece of a lot of the deliverables that were related to public television, all the videos that came out from the series, pledge-only items that we would use on the air. Don't forget, we on public television have to merchandise a lot, even our children's programming, in order to garner the support that we need. Now, I cautioned our partners, and I say it in the book, and they understand what I said, not to over-market and oversaturate. But again, as I said to you, it wasn't just our partners with the legal merchandise. It was all the other merchandise, because children wanted an attachment to this character. They wanted something to it, like you did with your pajamas and everything else. You wanted everything Barney. So there was a market for it. There was a way that we could benefit from it. I mean, Connecticut Public Television, thankfully, and the PBS system, we split a lot of proceeds on certain merchandise, and we made lots of money. We made millions upon millions of dollars, not enough to sustain us forever, but a goodly portion. Did we make as much as our for-profit partners? No, but that's the way the system does work, because you have to understand this, John. If public television said, we want to own outright everything we put on the air. Let me give you an example, and I'm not trying to, make light or short of what friends of mine did, Larry Lancet and Cecily Truitt. Around the time that we did Barney, they put together a series called The Puzzle Place, and it had all the right elements. And they were a for-profit entity as well. So was Sherry Lewis, who we competed with to get on the air. A lot of people don't know, but when we started, that was a test of whether we would do the best, whether Shiny Time Station would do the best, or whether Sherry Lewis in a new incarnation of Lamb Chop would do the best. So those were for-profit entities as well. Barney, even though we were canceled, everybody felt that PBS should have owned everything related to Barney. Well, if they had wanted to do that, instead of investing in the first 2 seasons about $4.8 million, let's say they went on record and they took it and bought everything for $20 million. Number one, we don't have the money. Number two, we're not that smart because they canceled us within the first month and a half we were on. So they didn't even imagine we were going to be a programming success, let alone a merchandising juggernaut. But had they done that, say, with The Puzzle Place, which I was mentioning, they would have been in hock. I don't know what they would have valued that property at, but let's say it was $15 million and it made no money. In fact, you'll find this very interesting, John, that the president of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting at the time, his name was Richard Carlson. He's still alive, I believe. But he said to Congress, as they were beating on public television, let Barney fund all of public television. How many times have they said that? Let Sesame Street fund public television. I mean, this has been the mantra forever by one party in America primarily. But having said that, he said, what you have to understand is this is a complex deal. And it was. And the deal got sweeter every year that the value of Barney went up and the value of being on public television for Barney went up. We changed the terms of the deal. But it was still, to some, never enough. By the way, Richard Carlson is Tucker Carlson's dad. And he was sticking up for public broadcasting. How do you like that?
Well, I have a feeling his son would not agree with him.
Well, I said something about that in the book because he talked about the complexity of the deal. And I said, maybe you want to talk to your son about making certain issues seem so simple when they are more complex.
Now, let's get into the people that so clearly hate Barney, who are pretty much the driving point of this documentary, I Love You, You Hate Me. Because while I do not condone their behavior, I frankly think it's just psychotic. And of course, it's just one of those things where I wonder, like, who hurt you? Like, who hurt you to make you so insane that you want to, like, just burn up, shoot, send death threats, all for a...
Well, don't you wonder that today in America generally?
Yeah.
Why so many people are so angry, why they have such grievance when they're living in a country that they say has provided them with a wonderful life. Maybe they think somebody's trying to take it away from them, somebody who doesn't look like them or perhaps comes from a different place they come from. Well, anyway, but get back to your point.
Yeah, no, but I want to ask, because the criticism leveled at Barney, I'm split on it because there's, of course, the part of me that's the fan that really loved his encouragement of, pretend, use your imagination, anything is possible. At the same time, I do understand the criticism of Barney being seen as unrealistically perfect, as wholesome, like, oh, everything is wonderful with the world. Everything is happy and just everything is great. And I wonder if there was any thinking in the process of producing Barney to make sure it's more levels, to let kids know that, yeah, anything is possible. At the same time, there are going to be moments where life sucks, and there's a way we could deal with that. Like, was that a very tricky thing to figure out when developing this character?
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, I don't think you're going to enter into too many educational and entertainment vehicles for young children where a lot of that complexity and that overlay of pessimism is a a dominant theme, because that's not what preschool educators do. I mean, if you go into most preschool settings, I would imagine it's a pretty positive place, John. I mean, they're showing colors and they're talking about things. Now, it is really, it's not fair to say, if anybody does, that we didn't address some very hard issues in Barney. They just were handled in such a deft manner. For example, there was an episode where a family was breaking up and the impact of that on the child. Fred Rogers dealt with that too. Fred Rogers dealt with a disabled child. Barney dealt with that too, and trying to sensitize the kids to differences among the population of young children. I guess what I'm saying is, if you go back, to be fair, to the 268 episodes, you will find some of that in there, but it will not be in a manner that hits you over the head. It will be in a manner where Barney brings it back to something life enriching and fulfilling, and the possibility of seeing those differences or understanding that her family may be different from your family. So it is not by any means something we didn't address, but I don't think people really took that into account when they looked at the series. They just saw this effervescent, jumping up and down purple dinosaur. But trust me, it's there. And the writers were very good. I know one of the writers, Steve White, is in the documentary. I don't think Jeff Bernthal is, but I know that Steve White is. He was the head writer, Mark Bernthal.
And the documentary, of course, gets into, the creator, Cheryl Leach, and how the Barney phenomenon has affected her family. I mean, we in particular hear some very unfortunate, tragic things about her husband and her son. So in terms of your daughter, I mean, as a Barney fan, did she have this surprise moment growing up where it's like, oh, wait a minute, life is not as crystal as maybe Barney portrayed it? Or was it a more seamless transition?
Yeah, no, she would probably tell you, I know she would tell you, that she really wasn't affected in the way, in other words, Cheryl and her family, and I don't really address that in the documentary, and I really won't. And, anytime you're writing something that hot that is really changing the culture in many ways, it has many effects, many effects that are local, many effects that are far reaching. And sometimes it's somebody coming up to you to say how something you did changed their life. You didn't really know it, but they would share that with you. In my case, because I was still in Connecticut and I was a co-producer, our station, I was very involved in many aspects of it, but I wasn't in it every day. I wasn't managing a lot of aspects of the entire property that Cheryl was. And Leora was really, she would say it, and she has said it. I don't think they left it in the documentary, but basically her life remained unchanged. And in fact, as she grew up, nobody around her, because it wasn't necessarily the coolest thing at certain points to say that you were the girl through whose eyes Barney became the phenomenon that it is. So she will tell you that basically it left our family life and our being rather untouched. Even though we were involved, it was at something of a different angle and distance.
Now, when I watched because of course I grew up with Mr. Rogers as well, and when I watched that beautiful documentary, of course the Tom Hanks film as well, the prevailing argument watching Mr. Rogers today is, man, use someone like Mr. Rogers in today's world. Would someone like Mr. Rogers work in today's world? Because wouldn't you believe it, tying it back to Barney, with all the cynicism and hate directed toward him back in the day, I mean, we are times 100, times 1,000 when it comes to that cynicism today. So very positive, comforting, encouraging characters like Barney, would they work in today's world? I mean, is there a good reason why he was canceled back in 2010, why he doesn't exist now?
Well, Connecticut Public Television was a co-producer for 17 years. And in 2009, we were told that the group that had bought Barney, there were two groups in between. There was HIT Entertainment, Henson International Television. They loved us. They gave us Thomas the Tank Engine to represent, Angelina Ballerina. We were the presenting station for that. And when they brought Bob the Builder back to public television, so we were involved in that. And then a venture capital group bought it. Now Mattel owns it. So there were a lot of changes that were involved. And also, if you notice, public television has gone from live action primarily to animation. And so it was a big change, a new decision maker at PBS, different principals involved on the Alliance Group or the Barney side, if you will. And we had moved aside. WNET became a partner with that new company, the venture capital group, Apex, because they were putting money into Angelina Ballerina. But back to your point, yes, it would work today. And it will work because Daniel Kaluuya is going to be doing a movie based on Barney, a live action. And I would imagine that Mattel is going to then probably propagate a new series of Barney. Why would it work? Because children inherently haven't changed. Maybe the culture has been changing because of some adults and their cynicism and their polarization and all of that. But the children are still the same, what they need to get started in life. So I think the question, and it was a good question that you asked, inherently what's most important is that Cheryl, Kathy, and Dennis knew they had penetrated the mind of a child by virtue of seeing the panoply of offerings at the time. And what they saw and what a child needs has not changed from 1992 to 2022. It's a short span of time, as much as so much has happened in the adult world since then.
Now, in the docuseries, they get into, say, Cheryl Leach's son, Patrick, and maybe the feelings of being replaced that he felt by his mom giving so much attention to, Barney. And, to that point, I wonder if you've gotten any feedback from some parents who were just like, oh, thank God, because, sometimes when you have a child, especially of that age, it can take a lot out of you. So what a relief it would be to have a show like Barney that is both entertaining and also teaches your children something. It keeps them, gaze. So have you had feedback like that from parents who just thought, great, it would be wonderful to do parent like Barney for like 30 minutes?
Oh, yeah. And in fact, I know that there are parents who still use Barney. But I will say this, that if you want to know whether that still works, let's take the fact that Fred Rogers' company in Pittsburgh is making Daniel the Tiger. And there's so much about Daniel the Tiger that has that. I think live action characters are the best for the young child, personally, because they're still living in a very tactile world. But having said that, my 17, 18-month-old granddaughter is fascinated by Daniel the Tiger and that messaging. Yes, Barney, and let's not forget this, John, and I know you don't, but I think in the documentary, and again, I haven't seen it, I will see it tomorrow, like everyone else. I think they overplay, perhaps, the negativity, because there were many more parents, and I go back over my clippings from that period when I was quoted in the New York Times and the Washington Post and everything else, where there were parents on both sides of this fence, but many loved Barney. And a lot of the women understood what Barney meant to their child and how the child might pick up after themselves as a result of Barney, want to go and take a bath willingly because of Barney, do this or that, good behaviors being modeled. So I think if we overstate what was going on at that time. Yes, of course, there were these people out there. Did they make a difference to the children? The children, who were the audience for this series, couldn't give a fiddler's damn what these people were saying. They had no interest whatsoever. And that would be the same today. And many parents would rush to it. And frankly, you talked about Fred Rogers. What an antidote Fred Rogers would be to those who are trying to divide us at this moment. Because when he would come to a PBS annual meeting, and I point this out in my book, No Dead Air, and you could hear a pin drop, John, because Fred chose every word with care and precision and knew the impact that it was having on an audience. And I point out in the book that my wife came to one PBS meeting, and we all had the opportunity to go up and say hello to Fred. And John, Fred did not come to a lot of PBS meetings. When he came, it was an occasion. Like when Ken Burns came, it was an occasion. And we would listen, spellbound, to these marvelous individuals who have educated and enriched all of our lives in America. And the first thing that happened when Fred was there and my wife got to the front of the line, she began to cry, and she was almost speechless meeting a man like Fred Rogers. How much was he vilified in his day and demeaned? And even some of the things about effeminate and such, which I understand come up in the Barney documentary, trying to pin a sexual element to Barney, they tried to do with Fred. I mean, these are all characteristics we've seen before, and time and again, the audience has their say in their moment as to the appropriateness of what Barney or Fred provided to them.
Yeah, I never understood that, because it was so the whole homosexual thing happened with Barney. It happened with Fred Rogers. It happened with the Teletubbies. There seems to be this idea that if you are a vulnerable, kind person, willing to express emotions, just authenticity in that matter, that somehow it just has something to do with your sexuality. So yeah.
Our society needs to get on a couch.
Pretty much. Well, Larry Rifkin, I mean, this has been a great conversation. You're the author of No Dead Air, which can you just give us a brief synopsis of that book? Because I'm already going to get
Okay. Good. It's a memoir, and it talks about a life lived in Connecticut where I didn't have to leave Connecticut to help create this national phenomenon. And it was a surprise to me as much as it was to anyone else. I call it my innocent find. And then to follow on, when I brought UConn women's basketball to television and the impact that has had on women's sports. So I was there, part of the origin story of two remarkable phenomena. And I talk about how unlikely a character I was in this scenario and how I never felt I was in the right place, but somehow I guess I found myself there. And I talk about a career that was not charted. I think a lot of people make the mistake of believing that people chart their course, that they know where they're headed. Frankly, I had no idea, but I started as a radio brat. My father was a radio station manager. I was trying to avoid going into broadcasting, but it was inevitable. And I carved out what for me was a great career. I never made the many, many, many millions that people might ascribe to the whole Barney phenomenon. I was just doing my job, and I got compensated fairly, but I never wanted to self-aggrandize off of it. I really believed in the ethos of public television, and I kind of lived my whole life that way, and it's been a wonderful life. And I talk about my wife. I honor many people along the way who mentored me, who saw in me things that I didn't see in myself. So it's not a self-help book, but people tell me they really love the attitude that I pose in it, a very questioning one. I get into my own self and I question a lot of things about my own confidence level. And yet I think that's what drove me throughout. And that's it. It's a fun book to read. People say they hear my voice. So if you've been listening to this podcast and you hear the way I speak, that's the way the book reads.
Awesome. Well, I am a broadcasting nerd to the highest degree, so I'm definitely going to be looking forward to reading your book, No Dead Air. And also, of course, you're one of the interview subjects in the I Love You, You Hate Me docuseries about the rise and fall of Barney, the Purple Dinosaur, and that's going to be streaming Wednesday the 12th on Peacock. We're recording this on Tuesday the 11th, just the night before it comes out.
The Anything Show with John Francois is on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get podcasts. Join us on YouTube, Facebook.com/The Anything Show, and Instagram and TikTok @Anything Show Francois.